Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about their important work and the stories behind them. The First Amendment is vital for our democracy, and it lays out that we, the people, have freedoms of speech, of assembly, of expression, of the press, to check our government and to speak out when they've crossed the line. Many of us are using those freedoms right now to hold the current administration accountable, with No Kings and ICE Out Now protests going on across the country over the last year. Mark and Paula Engler are celebrating the 10th anniversary of their book, This Is An Uprising: How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century. The book shows why organizing matters and points to examples in history that can be templates for people who are seeking to regain their power against these systems of oppression. Mark Engler, who is one of the co-authors, is joining me now to talk about his book. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So let's go back to 2016 when you both first released this book, and it's kind of hard to believe that it's been this long, but that was the 2016 presidential election, the versus Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And, you know, we had this dynamic with a reality TV star who was running against someone who many people thought would become the first woman president. I'm wondering, was there something specific about that time that inspired you both to want to write or release the book?
Yeah, so this is a project that we had worked on for a really long time. And to relay a little bit of my background, I was born in Iowa. I wrote this book with my younger brother, Paul. We grew up in a family in Iowa where my dad was a priest and my mom was a nun. They left their vocations in the Catholic Church in order to raise a family. And we were exposed to people in the Catholic worker tradition, followers of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, that would do houses of hospitality for the homeless and would also do nonviolent direct actions against nuclear war, against the war machine. They would sneak onto military bases like Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha and try to actually dismantle weapons of war, and they would be arrested for it and go to jail for long periods for these acts of resistance. This is what was called the plowshares tradition, because It was after the Bible passage to turn swords into plowshares, and they kind of almost were trying to literally do that. And we were exposed to that. We admired those type of actions and the way they were able to build small, dedicated communities of activists. But at the same time, as we became activists in our own right, in environmental movements and student labor movements, in international solidarity movements, we wanted to go beyond just those kind of small communities of hardcore believers and look at how people were building power and organizing on a much wider scale. And one important influence for us was the labor movement, particularly in Southern California. The Union Unite Here, which is hotel and restaurant workers. My older brother went to work for them, still works for them. Paul worked with them for a decade. And that was a really important model, seeing how the labor movement organizes. A really important model for us of groups that are building long-term power in workplaces, through community organizations that are real backbones for our democracy and for the ability to fight against the power of organized money. But at the same time we had that experience, we also had an experience of mass protests. So we were, I was in the protests in Seattle in 1999 against the World Trade Organization, and Paul was not there, but he also took part in kind of large protests of that era that targeted groups like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. These mass protests would blow up. They'd have big, effects. They would kind of defy the rules of regular organizing, but then they would also sort of die down and disappear, and people would wonder, well, what happened to them? And that was something that we were trying to think about, the relationship between different organizing models. And we noticed that these big mass mobilizations that were called spontaneous and emotional and kind of once in a lifetime experiences would appear with some frequency. They would happen again and again. So we saw it with the anti-war protests in 2003. We saw it with a wave of immigrant rights protests in 2006 that were very large. And then in 2011, with Occupy, with the Arab Spring, with the Indignados in Europe, anti-austerity movements in Europe, we saw this breaking out all over the place. And that kind of convinced us that we wanted to sit down and really think about these traditions. And so that's kind of the genesis of the book. And then, we wanted to write a book that was not specifically about Occupy or the Arab Spring or one specific movement, but that kind of looked forward to, what are the trends, the patterns of these type of mobilizations, and what is, a lot of what we write about is that there's a whole tradition of how to think about these things. This a field that's now known as civil resistance. And so we wanted to write about the field of civil resistance, how it's evolved, how nonviolent direct action has evolved over the last 100 years. And so, again, we wanted to be forward-looking instead of, we do write about things like Occupy, but we wanted to look at, well, what would be the next waves of direct action. Now, as you mentioned, this came out originally the first edition came out in 2016, and this came out at the end of the Obama era. And, and Occupy happened, during the Obama era. And this is an interesting thing where we often run into situations in our country where, we've elected the right people. We have people in office, and yet they are still not able to deliver necessarily the change that we want to see, right? And so the question then is, well, what are the other mechanisms that you can use to stand up and confront corporate power, to put pressure on politicians to carry out the promises they have? And we were releasing the book originally into that type of political climate. And then, of course, it was also an election year. And by the end of the year, now Trump is elected. And and then we see a totally different, civil resistance operating in a very different climate, and we're seeing again today in a climate where there's increasing authoritarianism, where there's, very alarming power grabs, and those lessons from how people in other countries, activists in other countries using civil resistance have confronted autocracies are now becoming very relevant here in the United States again. But, with the book trying to look forward to and anticipate new waves of resistance, then of course we saw that, a huge wave starting with the women's march as soon as Trump was elected the first time. We saw a new wave of, we saw the Me Too movement. We saw a new wave of Black Lives Matter all take place during that first Trump administration. And then, in the last year, we've seen, kind of a ton of resistance reemerge now in Trump's second term.
You mentioned that the Occupy movement, for instance, started during Obama's presidency. And I was really struck by you talking about the fact that sometimes you can elect the right people, and it's still hard to achieve really systemic change. I can't help but think about the fact that we did have such a significant Supreme Court decision with Citizens United that just opened up the floodgates of corporate money, and how that's a factor working against this kind of systemic change and, working against what broad-based social movements are trying to achieve.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the way I talk about this is, the gains of the rich are overdetermined, right? The rich and the powerful are used to getting what they want. Why? Well, that's what money and power are for, is to impose your will on others, to get your agenda. And, kind of the paradox and promise of democracy is trying to say, well, that's not how we're going to run our society, right? We're going to, we're going to have a democratic system where which is not just based on money and power and privilege, right? That people can hold some power, and so the tension with organizing is always, how do we combat that? How do we combat the idea that they usually get their way and they often win? And social movements don't always win. We can have huge strikes, we can have organizing, we can have that end in defeat. But at the same time, movements historically have made massive gains. And if you look at those moments over the last 150 years of US history where we've had the greatest egalitarian gains, whether that's around civil rights, whether it's around labor rights, whether it's around women's rights, all of these things, they owe to people coming together and organizing in a collective fashion. My faith in movements, my interest in movements is not in the idea that, we always prevail against the rich, but that movements have a capacity to surprise me. Despite being involved in politics for more than 30 years, movements have a capacity to do things that I don't think I wouldn't have guessed before was possible, right? And to accomplish things that all sorts of political observers say, this is not going to happen, that's never going to move, that's completely off the radar. And how do you take an issue like same-sex marriage, which was, a third rail issue that no politician could ever touch, right? And a cultural war issue that was used to, bludgeon progressives, and take that from the fringes to being a mainstream issue and a winning issue in our society, and that takes movements and that takes organizing. Now, it's very alarming to look at Citizens United. It's very alarming to look at money in politics. And all of those things are things we need to fight against, right? So then the question is, well, how do we fight? And I was just reading an account of an organizer in Minnesota, and she said, in a lot of countries, in undemocratic countries, one of the biggest barriers to acting is fear. And so they have to overcome the barrier of fear. And she said, well, in the US, the biggest barrier that we often confront is skepticism. People just don't think that you can do anything. And we're schooled in this theory of change, which believes what the tradition of civil resistance called the monolithic view of power, which is that all the power resides with presidents and CEOs and senators and generals. And so there's not really much you can do. You can vote in an election, maybe you can file a lawsuit, but you can hire a lobbyist, but your range of options is very limited, right? And social movement organizing in general and civil resistance in particular really takes on that idea. And that's not true at all. So first of all, it takes on that theory of power, and it presents against the monolithic view of power. It presents a social view of power, and it says, governance, the rule of a regime requires the participation, the cooperation of the governed. And at the moment when people stop cooperating and act in disruptive ways, the system falls apart, right? It can't function without people obeying orders, without the tax collectors going out and collecting taxes, without, teachers teaching students, without people carrying out the ordinary business as usual. And so there's tremendous power in noncompliance, non-cooperation, and in the power of disruption. And that world of civil resistance opens up a huge range of tactics that are available to us that go beyond just litigation and elections. And those things are important, of course, but protest movements can use a huge range of things. It's not just organizing a march or, a large demonstration, but it's boycotts, it's strikes, it's occupations, it's artistic resistance, it's bureaucratic non-cooperation. It's a huge range of tactics that we have in this repertoire to be able to act. And so that's, for me, a great gift that this tradition of civil resistance offers. And it's one of the things that's rewarding about writing this book, This Is An Uprising, about studying this tradition and talking about that with others.
So we've had some very significant social movements for change in this country. And the last 10, 20 years, LGBTQ rights, which you mentioned, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. But we have also seen really powerful backlashes against these movements. And obviously, there's a huge history of this with the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, the suffragist movement, on in our history. I'm wondering what are some of the tactics, the strategies that people can deploy when the going really gets tough after a few years into the movement and the drumbeat starts? You've gone too far. It's time to move on. How do you sustain things? Because we've seen movements like the Occupy movement, they have fizzled.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of different ways to think about this. Mass protests are kind of the most visible moments, when people oftentimes learn about movements, pay attention to movements. And those movements have very specific dynamics, in the way that they capture attention, the way that they can drive an issue forward. But those movements come from someplace, they come from, oftentimes they have roots in groups and in organizers who are, have been working for many years prior to those, and then they have afterlives and effects, and so a lot of those movements, there's a public response of seeing them when they're most visible, and then and then they do die down. There are cycles of movements, and then people are like, well, what happened to those? I don't know, and then they kind of think, well, they must not have done anything. And in fact, those movements can have big impacts, that you have to sit down and trace out, right? And kind of look at, well, what were the after effects of that? So something like Me Too is something we talk about in the afterword of our new book, which affected things in many, many different ways. Well, first of all, there's legislation. There's a federal bill passed, and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of state level, anti-harassment bills or changes to laws on non-disclosure and all sorts of things that you can trace out. And then there are changes in the court system with how, sexual assault cases are handled within the legal system. There's cultural changes. There's reckonings within pillars of society, within churches, the Baptist Convention or other places where there's huge scandals that rock those whole organizations and have long reverberations. So all of those things are things that you can sit down and trace out and try to identify, the long-term ramifications of these things. But most people, of course, don't do that work. They see the kind of the biggest protests, and then they don't kind of see the long tail. And so I think, again, in combating cynicism, it's important to emphasize that these protests have big impacts. If we look at the Women's March, it wasn't just that people showed up for the Women's March. That fed directly into electoral efforts. It fed into efforts to combat their Republicans' attempts at that time to repeal Obamacare, and then it fed into directly into the midterm elections, where you had a huge wave, that defeated the Republican majority in Congress and stymied the first Trump administration's ability to do a lot of things. Now, it still did lots of bad things, and we still had, every time we have a movement, we also have to reckon with the limitations of it, and we have to reckon with, how do we better sustain the long-term energy of a mass mobilization. So a lot of that's a question of absorption. We see this right now in Minnesota, not just in Minnesota, all over the country. People are showing up to trainings for, legal observers, for anti-ICE type of things in local neighborhoods in huge numbers. People, local communities will create a call, and hundreds of people will show up for that, right? And so that's a challenge. That's not going to be a forever thing. So the challenge then is, well, how do we absorb that energy? How do we create lasting structures that can keep people engaged over the long term? And I don't think that there's a magic bullet to that, but part of that is understanding, again, the interaction between different organizing traditions. So looking at protests not as something these peak moments, what we call moments of the whirlwind, not as something that detracts from other types of work, whether that's long-term structure-based organizing, building up those institutions, or whether it's electoral organizing. Not looking though at that as something that detracts from those, but something that brings in new recruits, that brings in new energy, that creates new resources for movements that can then continue organizing in other ways as well.
You were mentioning that you grew up in Iowa, and I think for a lot of people, that's not the first place you would think of where you would be kind of schooled in this social consciousness, Catholic tradition. But as someone who went to the University of Iowa and spent 10 years there in Iowa, there definitely is an activist movement. There definitely are faith communities that have been very interested in social justice and workers' rights. Can you talk with us a little bit about your upbringing? And also, we've seen some really profound changes with Pope Francis and now with Pope Leo, with what they're emphasizing in terms of the Catholic faith. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So there are great traditions of Midwestern radicalism. I grew up in Iowa. Most of my extended family is in Wisconsin, and you have a great progressive and socialist traditions in Wisconsin. Obviously, the stuff that's happened in Minnesota right now, is not an accident. The Twin Cities there have been, a real beacon of hope in the last 10, 15 years of kind of how to use progressive power to create lasting change. People call that the Minnesota model, and it got some attention when Tim Walz was nominated and so forth. But that's a great, interesting model of community groups, unions, labor, faith-based groups, combining community organizing with mass protest, with electoral organizing, and having some really serious gains to show for that. But growing up in Iowa, there were movements in the 1980s. The Central American Solidarity Movement was really based in churches, throughout the country, but Midwestern churches as well. And so that was something, when I was young, we saw the movie Romero and learned about, Central America. And this was a situation where the Reagan administration was supporting death squad governments, in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, And so that was an experience of learning, that people were standing up and opposing their government. There was a massive sanctuary movement to deal with and welcome refugees that were coming from those crises that the United States was funding in those places. And religious people had a big role in those movements. Romero was the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was assassinated. You had 4 church women who were killed in a famous incident around the same time. And so that was something that, being involved in that Catholic peace tradition, we were just kind of aware of. And that was one of, the Central American Solidarity Movement in some ways was a bright spot in the 1980s of really standing up to the Reagan administration and trying to constrain, the imperial impulses of them and to stop there from being another Vietnam, in El Salvador, active troops on the ground. So that was something I was exposed to. The Catholic worker tradition, as I talked about before, following Dorothy Day, it's kind of a U.S. Version, of what you could call liberation theology. It was, it was a domestic tradition that was rooted in these peace and justice traditions. But then later on, too, I became interested, and even as a student in college, I studied and wrote about liberation theology. I lived and worked in Central America for some time. So that idea of Latin American liberation theology was something that emerged out of Vatican II, all of the changes that were going on in the church in the 1960s. Really gave an impetus for priests, for religious people, for theologians in Latin America to create, to assert a type of Catholicism that said, too often the church has been on the side of the powerful. Too often we've had priests and bishops that are having lunch with these, generals in these death squad governments. And instead, we need a church that's rooted in the people. There were, programmatic aspects of that in terms of building kind of grassroots structures in the church, what they called base communities. And there were theological elements of that as well. So ideas like the preferential option for the poor, the idea that God is not neutral, but if you read the Bible, God is on the side of the poor. And there has been backlash against that. That's been a fight within Catholicism. But at the same time, and particularly with Pope Francis, you had a mainstreaming a lot of theological doctrine out of liberation theology that actually now is kind of part of Catholic social teaching. The idea that that these ideas are actually very firmly rooted, both in previous encyclicals, papal encyclicals, but also in in the Bible itself, has been very well established. So yes, you do have those traditions kind of in the Catholic Church, where sometimes you have the church playing a conservative role, particularly in the United States, and then you also have kind of this liberationist tradition, and you have bishops, you have the Pope stand up for ecological justice, for immigrant rights, and sometimes make very powerful statements.
So you and Paul have re-released your book. It's been 10 years. What inspired you to do that? Why did you feel like now was the right time?
Well, obviously with the second Trump administration, we're seeing a massive wave of resistance where people are very much engaging with these ideas. They're putting to use the tactics and strategy and perspectives, concepts from the field of civil resistance. So we absolutely wanted to contribute to that. But in general, the response to the book over the last 10 years has been tremendous, not just in an intellectual sense or a journalistic sense of people want to read the book, but we've been in touch with, ever since the book has come out, with organizers that really want to experiment with this. How do we combine the energy and dynamism of mass protest and of nonviolent direct action with the long-term absorption and institutionalization so that we can make these gains last, right? And people are creating organizing models that try to do that. So that's been a really exciting thing, that has gone on since the book's first come out, where we've been involved with a whole range of different groups that are experimenting and innovating on the tradition. So the 10th anniversary just gave us a chance to reflect on some of those engagements, to talk about some of these big waves of protests that have happened in the last 10 years. And then, of course, to reintroduce the book in a moment where I think people are very hungry. They're hungry for these ideas and hungry for kind of a practical and strategic perspectives, where it's not just kind of morally standing up and speaking truth to power, which of course is important, but actually talking about, well, how do we build strategies around this? How do we build power around this? How can this stuff work? And I think that those are conversations that we absolutely need to be having.
We've seen many nonviolent protests during Trump's first year in office for his second term, whether it's the No Kings protests of last year or the ICE Out protests. But unfortunately, we've seen some violent responses from the administration, most notably to U.S. citizens who were killed in Minneapolis, Alex Preddy and Renee Good. And of course, there have been many other deaths at the hands of border agents as well. What is your assessment of how of the strength of this movement, and how can people effectively resist at a time where you do have a government that is willing to engage in violence sometimes?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that what these type of protest movements do best is to highlight the fact and highlight the reality of tremendous state violence. That's the reality of what we're confronting. There's masked agents with no identification jumping out of unmarked vehicles and abducting people off of the streets. That's what we're witnessing. That's a very frightening thing, and that's something. Of course, that we've witnessed in other countries and other parts of the world, and movements have had to figure out how do you respond to that. And when you have the kind of massive response from a community coming together, when you have dozens, hundreds of people filming what's happening, documenting what's happening, providing mutual aid, whether that's groceries, whether it's driving people someplace, of tracking what's happening, refusing to go along with this and cooperate. This does, it's tremendous. It does a huge service in highlighting that the violence that's going on is being perpetrated by the state. So yeah, I think that that's essential, and it allows, what in the field they call the paradox of repression, which is actually a lot of times these moments, and we saw this in the civil rights movement, where there is intensive repression. Nonviolent direct action has a way of shining a spotlight on that and engendering a huge public response, so that the repression, in fact, doesn't work, right? So, we've seen these horrific killings of people like Renee Good being shot, and instead of that scaring people, right, the intent of violence and repression is to scare people. Well, go home, right? This could happen to you. Mm-hmm. And instead, you see the opposite. You see people pouring onto the streets, people outraged, people seeing things, and they're witnessing it with their own eyes, because this stuff is being documented. Someone like Renee Good is being labeled a domestic terrorist, and people can see that. They can see with their own eyes that this is, rank propaganda, and that the type of response going on is important and necessary. So I think that what this, it's only through that organizing, it's only through that solidarity that allows us to, create a situation of very alarming state violence and turn it into something where there is a public response, where people are not simply cowed and scared and unable to respond. And of course, fear is real. People are scared, but they're overcoming that through collective action, right? This is a situation where we know we can't wait for for the law firms to come and save us, the universities to come and save us, the Democratic Party to come and save us. We can't wait for the next election. Yes, elections are important, right? But we know they're going to try to steal them. We know that there's time between elections where they're doing, wantonly unlawful things. And people need to have avenues where they can stand up and resist that. And so these movements of civil resistance provide that tactical toolbox that's so important, that we're seeing being deployed to great effect in Minneapolis and other places. And that I do find very inspiring, and it does give me hope in the face of very daunting, terrifying state violence,
Right. One of the big complaints from the Trump administration and from some people in right-wing media about the anti-ICE protests in Minneapolis in particular is that they have been too well organized. And I recently spoke with Michelangelo Signorelli, who is an LGBTQ activist, radio host, and he actually got his start with ACT UP in the 1980s. And I know that you in the book write about that group extensively and their tactics. I'm wondering, what were they doing in the 1980s to agitate for people with AIDS and making sure that they get care and that they were not ostracized? How could that be a model for protesters even now, 40 years later?
ACT UP is a wonderful model. I mean, you raise a number of interesting points in that question that are great. One is very funny, which is that the right you had these right-wing influencers or whatever say that they infiltrated some sort of signal group, mutual aid signal group in Minnesota, and they were shocked at how well organized it was. And that's, it's a comical moment, but it's actually very revealing, because it does reveal how people think about protest movements, how people think about organizing, which is that they are purely emotional, that they're purely spontaneous. And so
right.
To say,
I think so much about the kind of the mythology around Rosa Parks, that she was just tired one day and then suddenly it sparked this spontaneous civil rights movement, instead of, the truth that she was an NAACP activist. And this was very well planned, and they knew that she would be a very good person to carry this message.
Right. Well, and that's a great example. And it's, that's something that I would talk about too, is the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, there's a truth to Rosa Parks. She was a longtime activist. It was not a pre-planned action. It's not like they put her up to it and she did it, So there was a moment where she did say, enough is enough. I'm going to take an action. But the entire community then had to decide. And she was not the first to do that. So, of course, there was Claudette Colvin, who died recently, who's another, a younger activist who had done a similar act of resistance maybe 6 months before Rosa Parks. But that didn't result in the bus boycott. So this was a moment where the community said, yes, this is a great test case of something that happens, that we can rally the entire community. Now, if right-wing activists had infiltrated that movement, what they would have seen was that there was this massively well-organized networks of carpool, pickup and drop-off locations, of all sorts of delivery systems that allowed that bus boycott to work, that got people, where they needed to go, got people to work, and allowed them to sustain this, even though they were making tremendous sacrifices. People were totally disrupting their ability to go about their business and their lives by not riding the buses in the segregated South. But there was a tremendous level of organization that carried that movement through. And so it is funny, because anyone who studies social movements will see again and again and again the huge level of organization, oftentimes decentralized organization, that goes on, to sustain these movements. ACT UP I love, because this is an example. It's more, a lot of times we do go back to the 1960s to talk about protest movement, but ACT UP is, again, it's a 1980s movement. We talked about Central American solidarity. Another highlight, there's a few highlights in the 1980s that you can point to. Central American solidarity, anti-apartheid activism in solidarity with South Africa, and ACT UP as a movement against AIDS. Is, we write about in our book. I encourage people to read it, to read other books, like Sarah Schulman has a monumental oral history of ACT UP that was out recently. But yes, this was a movement of people who were, as a community that's completely marginalized, completely despised, who came together to organize around a public health emergency. There were mutual aid elements of that, or of communities that came together to take care of one another. But ACT UP was kind of the direct action arm, was the kind of in-your-face, polarizing movement that said, we're not going to be quiet about this because, and this was their slogan, silence equals death. If we're quiet about this, we're going to die. Our communities will die. And they had all sorts of very provocative, daring, direct actions, some of which were quite controversial, and we caused internal debates of, well, was this action well planned? Some of them undoubtedly were. Others maybe pushed things to where it, did create backlash that maybe outweighed the benefits. But on the whole, ACT UP was a tremendously effective movement in changing public consciousness about AIDS, and very importantly, asserting a role for people who had AIDS in the development of treatment for that disease. And you had people, including Anthony Fauci, who was, who was involved as a physician in AIDS treatment well before he was known, as a COVID czar. And you have people who will talk about how ACT UP and that style of activism was transformative in the way that AIDS was understood, the way that, drugs were being developed, the way that the health community responded. So yes, absolutely, I would encourage people to read up on it, study that example. It's a great one. It's a little bit more recent in our history as well.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. Mark's book with his brother Paul is Is An Uprising: How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century. It has been re-released after 10 years. Mark, thank you. I really appreciate you speaking with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.